Yeah.
Doctrine is just another word for teaching. So when you use the word doctrine, that's what you're saying. You're saying teaching. Hebrews 6 from the top. Therefore, landlord. Therefore, as even the principles of the doctrine of Christ, there is no wrong unto perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance for dead work and of faith toward the Most High, too, of the doctrine of baptism, and of laying on of hands, and of the resurrection of the dead, and of eternal judgment. Resurrection of the dead, judgment, laying on the hands, that's the doctrine, resurrection of the dead, judgment, laying on the hands, that's the doctrine. How could you deny it? This teaching is equal like a family. Wouldn't even be alive if we could just see it through the ground. But it got stripped down and says that we get deep. Proposals sacrifice from soft disputes and past with armies that fled into Africa. Now these people are the place going up and down and never existed. In the heavenly realm at the right hand of the Father where he's sitting. Waiting on that word. Waiting on that word. Talking about to give on that word. He's coming to that third. And many will be destroyed. Then follow instruction. Go out and get by your life and multitude and the water and you. But you talking about the baptism and the washing and the water of the word. But the spirit is very different. John had the greatest work. While the family was living in the election say he had the greatest work. Well, his name was John the Baptist. He was bringing that some word. Tell you follow Christ. Right? Well, Christ got some word. Jesus serving is not greater than the master. Then he served like his name.
Shema Yasharala Ahaya.
Alahaya Nawa Ahaya Akkad. Hero Israel. The Lord our power is one power.
Shema Yasharala Ahaya.
Alahaya Nawa Ahaya Akkad. Hero Israel. The Lord our power is one power. Shema Yasharala Ahaya. Alahaya Nawa Ahaya Akkad. Hero Israel. The Lord our power is one power.
All right.
No.
Shalom. Breath taken away. All right, I want to thank you for joining us for Thursday night Bible study. We give all the glory and praise to the Most High, Ahaya, our Lord and Savior, Yeshua Mashiach, and Baruch the Holy Spirit. Peace to all the 12 tribes that are scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. And shalom to those that are not of the blood lineage of Israel, but because they keep laws, statutes, and commandments, they have the surname of Israel. Thank you all for joining us on live stream. Thank you for your questions and comments, maybe on the chat.
Maybe.
All right. So we're going to open up with the book of Galatians, and just like when we opened up with the book of Corinthians. With 1 Corinthians, we talked a little bit about the city itself. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk a little bit about the city of Galatia and then get into the lesson. Now, Paul, when he wrote to Corinth, we understand that Corinth was one of the worst churches that he ever started up. Galatia, they were there also, right? But Galatia was a little different than Corinth, as we're going to see. Galatia is in Asia Minor, and it's Turkey. Now, the book of Galatians was not written to just Galatia. Paul actually had 4 churches, and there were 4 cities, and these 4 cities comprised of Galatia. So there were 4 cities. There were 4 individual churches within Galatia. Okay, but they were all called Galatians. And Galatia was kind of in modern day Turkey. Okay. So we're going to go over to Galatians chapter 1, and we're reading verses 1 and 2. As we talk about the city, Galatians 1 and 1, Paul, an epistle, not of men, neither by man, but by Yeshua and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all brethren which are within me, unto the churches of Galatia. So you see in verse 2, it says church is with an S. So there were more than one church in Galatia. In fact, there were 4 cities, and the 4 cities were Pessinus, and Carna, and Tavum, I think, and Galatia. Pessinus, Tarnum, and Arcanium with Galatia. Okay, so Paul was writing to these churches, even though they were not separate. They were 4 churches in Galatia, but they were all under one roof. Not physical roof, spiritual. 4 churches, 4 different cities, one church. Paul says something that's often misquoted. We're going to go to Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. So the letter is addressed to the churches of Galatia, and the readers of the letter are called Galatians. That'll conclude the Bible study for tonight.
Oh, really?
Galatians 3 and 1 says, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, but for whose eyes Yeshua have been evidently set forth, crucified among you. Now, when Paul said, O foolish Galatians, he was talking because there was some Jewish people who were trying to throw the Mosaic law on the Galatians, and they were really hitting them with the Mosaic law. And there was one in particular that Paul had to address, because there was one that was really one of the Galatians that was really out there. And Paul used the book of Galatians to address him, but he also used it to address the church itself. So you can say that when it came to Galatians, that their one thing was about allowing these people from Judaism, people who were following Judaism, they were trying to mess with what they were doing.
I thought they were Israelites.
What do you
So it
mean?
was because you said they were Jewish people.
Yeah, they were. They were following Judaism.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
All right, so the name Galatia actually comes from the Gauls. And the Gauls migrated from Thrace, which is your modern day Istanbul, and they went into Bulgaria, Greece, and modern day Turkey. Now, let's do a little history. What country did the Gauls go to and found it after they left Turkey? Mesopotamia, no. The Gauls are a group of people, and they migrated from Turkey, and they left Turkey, even though the name now is Galatia, which is the people of Gaul. They left and they went somewhere else. And that country is a European country today. Rome is not a European country. Anyone on the chat before we continue?
Okay.
Europe is a continent.
Why did Shamaria say circumcision?
It's because we were talking about the laws.
Oh, the laws. Okay. I'm like, wait a minute. Did I miss something?
The circumcision is not a country. All right, let's continue. France. Okay, France. So, North Central Asia Minor.
Oh, she said Germany.
Close. France. So later on, Galatia, they kept the name, and they were referring to a Roman province. So they kept the name after the Gauls had left. The country was Lysteria, Derbe, Iconium, and Antioch. We're going to go to Galatians chapter 1, and we will read verses 12 through 24. So Paul gives an kind of an autobiography of himself.
You said 1?
Galatians 1, 12 through 24. Now, Paul was born in Tarshish, which is very close to Galatia. We know that Paul was studied under Gamaliel. He was trained in the scriptures. He knew the traditions. He was basically a rising star in Judaism. Paul was up and coming Pharisee. And then that all changed. Galatians chapter 1, starting at verse 12, it says, "For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Yeshua. For ye have heard of my conversation in times past in the Hebrews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it." So he's speaking of how he started off being a Pharisee. 14 says, "And profited in the Hebrews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers." And he was very zealous. And he took that zealousness and he went to serve Yeshua. 15, "But when it pleased God, whom separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which are apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again into Damascus." So he's talking about his journeys on where he went He's talking about prior to the missionary trips that he did.
He had to have a lot of courage to go out on his own like that.
Right. After what?
He had a bad reputation after everything he had done.
Right.
Yeah.
See, he learned. See, verse 18 says, "Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. So he went home, basically. 3 years. So he just didn't start preaching the word after the road of Damascus, after he was healed from being blind. He just didn't go into preaching. He went home and re-studied, took everything that he learned from Gamaliel and re-studied the scriptures. Who did that for him? The Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Verse 19, but other of the apostles saw I none save James, the Lord's brother. And we know that James wrote the book of James. So all the other apostles were going and out and doing their own thing under the guise of Yeshua. Peter was there in Jerusalem, and James. Now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not. Afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea, which were in Yeshua. But they had heard only that he which persecuted us in times past now preacheth the faith which once he destroyed, and they glorified God in me. So he's talking about, I believe, in Acts, the 22nd chapter. He's talking about that time frame and later on in the book of Acts. Remember, the book of Acts is not in order. It's kind of out of order, especially after Peter and the conversion of the Romans. It kind of gets out of order in areas. So Paul, the word Galatia in Asia Minor were inhabited by Galatians. These were people who migrated from Gaul into France in about the 3rd century. Okay. So Paul addressed this epistle to the churches in the northern Galatian region, in the north part of the region, the 4 cities. Paul wants to expose the people who are following Judaism because they had some impure motives. If we go to Galatians chapter 6, verse 12, it says, as many as desire to make fair shew in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Yeshua. For neither they themselves are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. What does that mean? That means that these circumcised Israelites, they were pressuring the Galatians to become circumcised so they can say, see, look what we did. We circumcised every single one of those adult men, those young men. We did that. The scripture says in verse 13 that they may glorify in your flesh. So their motives were not good.
Right.
Paul talks about false gospels in Galatians 5:1. And he says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Yeshua hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. What is the yoke of bondage? It was these Jewish people and some Israelites who were basically threatening the church of Galatia with the laws, with the old Mosaic laws. And they were telling them, you are not part of this crew if you are not keeping the old laws. And Paul had to admonish them for that. When Paul wrote wrote his letter to Galatians, he wrote it to a few churches. People believe that Galatians most likely the first book that was written in the Old Testament. In fact, Galatians is one of the first books that was written in the Old Testament. Is probably the oldest book. Not Old Testament. One of the first books written in the New Testament, and it is the oldest book of the New Testament. It was written about 49 A.D. It was the first before the Gospels, because the Gospels was written sometime about 55, 57, 58. Corinth was written about 58, 59. The other Gospels, we know that Revelation was written close to 90 AD. So 49 AD was about when the book of Galatians was written. And the Galatian church was a mix of Israelites and Gentiles, and they were converts. And the Jewish believers tried to convince them that all the Gentiles have to be circumcised before they can fellowship. And Paul clarified that on what he initially taught them. See, Paul initially told them, no, they didn't have to do that. Faith is what you need. And the grace of Yeshua is to anyone. And he mentioned that to Ephesians, which we're going to talk about next week. We're going to go back to Galatians, the first chapter, and we're going to read verses 6 through 9. Galatians 1, 6 through 9. Paul was really angry at the way the Galatians were so easily influenced away from the truth. Because he told them that their salvation is not dependent on human work. And that's something that we all need to know. Our salvation is not dependent upon human work. It depends on the belief that Yeshua died and was resurrected. It is the belief of love thy neighbor, love the Lord thy God. That is your salvation. Believe it or not, it's simple. Yeshua did not make it convoluted or hard for us to get and understand it. But we, because of this, our flesh, we continue to fall and fall and fall because we allow this flesh to just circumvent us. Then you hear the devil telling you all kinds of things.
Lies.
And you believe the lies of the devil. When Yeshua says, all you got to do is love the Lord, love your neighbor, believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua.